Happy Friday the 13th. Welcome to Abyss Gazing, the podcast where we celebrate all things spooky and mental health.
I'm a co-host, Mark.
I'm your co-host, Josh, and we are joined by our Friday the 13th correspondent at this point, 9 movies deep, Mr. Anthony Ripo from our friends over at the Retro Gamers podcast.
Hey guys, thanks for having me back again. How's it going?
Of course.
I was trying to remember. I was like, man, you look familiar, and I don't know why.
You don't remember? Was it Jason X or Jason Goes to Hell that we did?
That was Jason X.
It was Jason X, yeah.
Wow, I have a bad memory, so
That's okay. I have a good memory of bad movies.
Yeah, this is going to be a this will be an interesting episode too, to say the least, because I feel like when Anthony and I started this whole journey, this was the movie that I was kind of looking forward to talking about the most.
Yeah, I think I was with you on that because this was a culmination of two iconic franchises, and I was curious to see what your thoughts were going to be of it, because at the time when we first started, you were only watching the Friday the 13th movies as we got to an episode to record. You didn't want to watch them ahead of time, so they would be fresh because you had never seen them before. Mm-hmm. And then at some point along the way, you just gave up and binged them.
I did. Well, Shot Factory put out that beautiful set, and I was like, I need to have this, like, as a physical collector. Like, it's gorgeous. Like, Friday the 13th is probably not even in my top 5 favorite horror franchises, but I am an art collector at the end of the day, and it's gorgeous. So, but no, I'm probably gonna show my age here. This was my introduction to both of these franchises.
Fair.
I don't think I've actually seen all the Friday the 13th, and I don't think I've actually seen all the Nightmare on Elm Streets.
Ah. Interesting.
Like, I was talking about it last night when we were watching it, me and my wife. I know I've seen Friday the 13th 1 and 2, and I saw Jason Goes to Hell in the theater. And I know I've seen like the first one, maybe the second of Nightmare on Elm Street, and the one that takes place in the asylum, and then the final Friday that was in, like, part of it was in 3D back in the day.
Oh, Freddy's Dead, the Final Nightmare.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, that's a movie.
I saw the remake too.
I really like it's the Final Friday. Like, I really wish I would have been alive and, like, been a fan of that franchise when that happened, because when you look at freddy-krueger's just absolute domination of the 80s and the slasher, like, Jason was kind of coming down in popularity, Freddy was kind of going up. That scene from New Nightmare with the talk show, and you kind of see, like, how everyone's, like, reacting to Freddy. Like, that's how it was. So much so that they actually, and Anthony, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but Freddy-Krueger got a fake funeral as part of the promotional thing for Freddy's Dead, the Final Nightmare. And I wanted to have attended that funeral so bad.
Oh yeah, of course. Freddy's Dead for me was one of the, I saw that in the theater when I was younger, and if I'm remembering correctly, which I might not be, but it was one of the last film I saw with my dad when he was alive. So that one, it's a terrible movie. It's just a terrible, terrible movie, but one that I have a very sweet, memory attached to.
Correct me if I'm wrong. Is that the one with Breckenmeyer and the power glove death?
Yep, that is the one. That was a good moment. That makes me smile in that movie.
Yeah. Oh, now I'm playing with power.
Yes. But lo and behold, Jason never showed up in any of the Freddy movies. It was actually the other way around until we got to this one.
Yeah, And so just for context, if you guys haven't checked it out, go check out our episode on Jason Goes to Hell from last year. I believe it's on the Victims and Villains feed. One of the things that they teased at the end of that was actually one of the final shots in that movie is Jason's hockey mask being dragged
Yeah.
down to hell by the famous glove, and for almost like 10 years. Like this movie was in development forever.
Yeah, and
And
I think a lot of that had to do with rights on Jason.
Hmm.
They've been bouncing around for years.
not at this point in time, because New Line was actually the ones that released Jason Goes to Hell. And the only reason that I believe that Jason X was even made was because they were still figuring things out. And that movie was a rights thing, so they made it so that they could keep and retain the rights. I could be wrong on that, but I think
It,
that's how it ended up working out.
that's somewhat familiar to me. But the Freddy Jason story, or the story to make the movie started somewhere around the late '80s when both of them were really two of the
At,
most
yeah.
popular horror franchises, and it was just that New Line didn't want to do it. They were approached and they were just like, no. And we actually got Jason Takes Manhattan because New Line said no, because that's when it was after part 6 or 7 when they were trying to tee up
Yeah.
Freddy versus Jason.
Which the history of this movie is crazy, and I
Mhm.
really wish I would have been Andy from Love What I Love, and he was one of the co-hosts that filled in for Mark earlier this spring. He highly recommends this book, and it's called Slash of the Titans, and it explores like over I think it's over like 20 different variations that came with this film, and like all like the different like versions that they had. And I gotta say, like there had to have been like quite a significant amount of these, because if this movie was in development since the late '80s, that essentially puts it in development for 12 to 15 years. Like it's legitimately crazy to me
Mhm.
how long this movie was in development.
I think part of it too is like we've seen with movies over the years where the actual studios and execs get too involved with the movie and
Yep.
it ends up either giving you a terrible movie or dragging it out till it gets canceled or both.
Hmm.
I mean, we saw it with the Wolverine Origins movie. The movie was absolutely horrible, what they did with
Yep.
Deadpool.
Yep.
And that was because Fox kept stepping in and telling them, no, we want it done this way.
Yep.
And the directors and writers kept telling us, like, you're going to piss off a lot of people. And they
Mhm.
just insisted this is how we wanted it done.
Yep.
So I think that's kind of part of what happened with this and why it took so long to come out was the studios kept wanting to have their way instead of making
Mhm.
it for the fans.
Well, that and also changes with studio executives on top of it.
Yeah.
And that plays into that. As a new executive comes in, they're going to be like, well, I don't, even if it was a good idea or a great idea, like some executives will come and be like, oh well, I had nothing to do with that script, so I don't want that script. I want a new script. I want something different. That's mine, quote unquote.
How often has that actually worked out on a movie?
Oh, all the time.
It never works out.
No, no,
Like
absolutely
No.
not.
look at the thing prequel. Excellent story. They set it up perfectly, but then the studio stepped in and said, we want them faster and scarier, and let's throw in a whole bunch of CG. And it's like, that's not what made the original one great.
Nope.
And that's what made that prequel not nearly as good was the CG and studio stepping in, do it our way, or you're not doing it at all.
Well, like keeping in mind too, like one of the Shout Factory special features that they had is they talked about the idea of in the early days when, as Anthony was saying, trying to figure out how to bring these two together. Jason was owned by Paramount, Freddy by Lionsgate, or not Lionsgate, New Line.
No line.
And one, both studios were interested in doing this, but it was this rights thing to where New Line would essentially have to license to Paramount or vice versa, and they ultimately didn't want to do that. And then after Jason Takes Manhattan, that's when we essentially got Jason Goes to Hell, and that's when a lot of those conversations kind of start happening. And finally, here it is in its full glory, released on August of 2023. So this movie celebrates 20 years. We're a couple
Mhm.
months late, but history of like the actual like production aside, what is your guys' history with this movie?
I saw it in the theater when it came out.
A
So it was at the time it was pretty fun. It was a big opening that weekend for it. And it was fairly full in the theater. So it was pretty cool to see. I had heard there was another ending to it that some theaters got, but I don't know if I've ever seen the other ending.
Uh,
do
it's on.
either of you
It's
know
on.
what the other ending is?
Yeah, it's on this weird little round shaped disc thing they call a DVD. If you actually watch it, because I have the DVD, they have the alternate
Oh,
ending
they
on
have
there.
okay. I've got the
Yeah,
DVD. I'll have to go pull it out and look.
yeah. Check out the deleted scenes, but it involves the ending involves the two leads, Will and Lori. Um, spoiler alert? Does anybody care?
No.
But yeah, but basically the idea is like they're together, everything looks like it's happy, they're happy, and then like Will starts to turn evil, and they kind of give you a hint that like he's either become like, I don't remember if he's becoming Jason or Freddy. I think it was actually Jason, but like that's how they end it. And from what I understand, like that was the original ending and test audiences didn't get it. So they actually had to go back and shoot what the theatrical ending wound up being. And the actor playing Jason in the theatrical ending was somebody else.
So, all right. So bear with me. So, is it my understanding that the original ending was going to bring back the parasite from Jason Goes to Hell? Because that's hearing you
It,
talk about it, that's what I'm like computing.
it might have. I honestly, I didn't go back and watch the alternate ending before we started recording, so I don't remember it exactly the way that it played out. But it played out something like that. But I don't think they brought. I don't know if they brought the parasite. They didn't bring up the idea of the parasite though.
Where did the parasite come from? Where
Jason
Jason
did
Goes
Goes
to
to
Hell.
Hell.
Hell. Yeah.
well, I know that, but where did they come up with the idea of in Jason Goes to Hell that it's a parasite?
Essentially, when Jason moved from Paramount to New Line, there were certain things that they could not actually do. And I think some of it actually is was that they couldn't use Friday the 13th as a name. So why when you look at the New Line era, it's Jason Goes to Hell, Jason X, Freddy versus Jason. Similarly to how Universal used Chucky. Part of the deal when they sold over, MGM was allowed to keep the Child's Play name, but Chucky could be used by another studio. That's the reason why
Mm.
Universal's made everything, and I think it was the same thing. So I know a lot of them, a lot of the reason that the New Line era of Jason is a little bit more experimental. I think it actually has to do with them having rights, like they couldn't do certain things.
Could they not use? I wonder if they had to change the story because I don't know if this is right or wrong, and I can't remember in Jason Goes to Hell if they weren't allowed to use the story with his mom because I don't think she was in Jason Goes to Hell. If
She's
I'm
n- she's not, but it's weird because she's in this movie.
right, but at
So
this point,
Yeah.
New Line I think owned all of it, if I'm not mistaken. I
New, I
thought they
mean,
did.
New Line owned the rights to yeah. They owned the rights back when Jason Goes to Hell came out. I don't know like to the the exact details of
Mm-hmm.
everything, but yeah. So I don't know. It's just
It's
that
messy,
whole
but that whole
yeah.
parasite thing to me was just terrible.
Yeah, it didn't make any sense.
Mm-mm.
It's such a weird movie, and I love it that it's weird. But honestly, like I think like when you look at this, coming into this movie, this is the end of an era because this is the end of This is the last New Line movie that ever made. This is the last movie we ever got with Robert Englund as Freddy-Krueger, and this is also the last time. Well, I guess those are the only two like swan songs for this one. But when you look at the what they were able to do in 3 films, they were such they were what the franchise needed because they kept the heart of that slasher, but it wasn't this copy and repeats that the first 8 movies did.
It was, but I just wonder as a counterpoint if they strayed too far, because although Jason Goes to Hell was profitable for them to warrant another movie, Jason X, which came out the year before Freddy versus Jason,
It was horrible.
It not only, but no, not only was it horrible, but it made so little money that it didn't make any money. Actually, it was a loss to the studio. That it also may have given them some concern about Freddy versus Jason coming out. Like they had to make sure that they were gonna hit a good mark with this one.
And I know one of the things that is like a big contention for like diehard Freddy versus or for Jason fans with this one. To your point, I'm curious if that's the reason why we didn't actually get Kane Hodder in this role. Because
No, that
Hodder,
wasn't it.
interesting. Okay, that's what I thought.
No, straight up, Kane Hodder was passed. Kane Hodder was passed up for on the role because, and again, no, not knocking. I think it's Ken Kersinger who got the role. That was his name. He was 6'5", and Kane Hodder was only 6'3". And Ronnie Yu, the director, wanted Jason to look more imposing to Freddy because Robert Englund was 5'9". So he went with somebody 2 inches taller.
I mean, they couldn't have just used some like lifts.
Right, exactly. It's like
Or,
it's a movie.
Tom Cruise does it all the time.
That's right.
You just Ronnie, you just lower the camera. You know, you get the angles better. Like,
Yeah,
that's literally the dumbest reason I've ever heard for
Yeah.
passing up a legacy actor.
yeah. I mean,
I know right now they're throwing money at Robert Englund to consider doing another Nightmare on Elm Street.
yeah, but he said 1,000 times over. He says he's too old.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, but then again, back up enough money.
That's what I said. From what I've heard, they're
back up enough money. How do you
at
say no? Although he endorse Kevin Bacon to take over the role at one point?
Yes.
I mean, he could. I could see it almost. He just doesn't have the sound for it, I don't think.
No, he would have
And
to
I think
do something with his voice.
Jackie Earl Haley wasn't bad, but his style and the size of him didn't fit. It just didn't look right.
Yeah, well, that and I mean, you can't do much with the script when it's that bad either. So, but that's a different story for another time.
Freddy versus Jason. You know what are you
guys? Back to
that. What's your I know Mark said that he saw this in the film. This was like one of
so
the
did
first.
Theater
one
as
of
well.
the I didn't get to catch us in theaters because again,
you were 5.
Conservative household. I was at 10
this point. At this point, you can't use conservative household as an excuse because I was too.
Look, man, I was a good kid. All right, I was very obedient, but we will get into that another thing. But anyways, I ended up seeing this on like pay-per-view with some friends in like middle school. So I guess I just kind of like debunked my own point saying this was one of the first horror movies that I've ever seen. So like this movie's not like it's not a great movie, but it's
a fun movie.
It's a fun movie, and it's like it's nostalgic for me. So
yes, no, and that's the word I always describe when anybody brings this up. What did you think of this? I say it was fun. Was it good? No.
I do think they wasted a little bit of opportunity having the girl from Ginger Snaps in it, and just had her in it for a couple scenes.
Yeah, that is true.
Ginger Snaps wasn't the cultural like cult classic then than it is now.
True.
Kind of always been a cult movie. Pretty much always. It came out, I think, direct to video, if I remember right. And it just kind of slowly snowballed downhill with how many people knew about it. So they had an opportunity to kind of use her to make her another Scream Queen. And they just kind of didn't in this movie.
No, not even close.
But I think her character here is so different from the character that she plays in the Ginger Snap movies that it's almost kind of like seems like an opportunity for her to not quite typecast herself, because there was had the sequel to Ginger Snaps come out before this movie, or is it 2004?
Oh, good question.
I don't know. I know they did like 3 of them.
There is 3 of them, but I'm just saying, like, for her as an actress, it may have been a just a chance to kind of go against what people like knew her as.
I will ask the gods of IMDb to tell me the answer. Ginger Snaps 2 was 2004, so it came out the year after.
I thought so. Okay.
Yeah.
And also could have been like a shooting schedule thing too. Like, I mean, you think of it like to go here again, like originally Drew Barrymore was supposed to play Sydney Prescott, and she actually liked the role of Casey Becker more, so she actually swapped, and that's when Nev Campbell came in and made that an iconic role.
Yeah.
They
got some good news concerning that. I don't know if you've heard.
Which is?
The writers and directors have said we want to pay Nev Campbell as much as she needs to come back, which was Matthew Lillard's demand for coming back as Stu.
Ooh.
He wasn't going to come back as Stu unless they paid her what they thought she deserved.
Oh, 7 might wind up being good.
I didn't think 6 was bad.
Yeah, same.
Oh, disagree. Lots of disagree.
I think 1 or 2 of the most hated in that series was some of his favorites. So, yeah.
Well, I'll say this. I just watched 5 again on my flight home from my last trip. And I'll tell you guys what I told my other friends about them is each time I watch 5 and 6, the less I like them. I keep finding more things. Like, it's weird. It's like I just keep finding more things wrong with them, and that I didn't notice the time before. Usually it's like you watch them again and you're like, oh, I missed that. That makes it better. I'm like, no, oh, I missed that. That's making it worse. So, but that's a whole other story.
And this is why I try not to, I don't want to say overthink, but if I really like a franchise, I will let it alone and won't revisit it every so often. Like, I love Scream. I watch Scream maybe once every few years. I love Freddy-Krueger. I watch his movie watch those movies like once every 5 years.
Mm-hmm.
So, I don't know.
If you or someone you know is listening to this podcast right now and you're struggling with suicide, addiction, self-harm, or depression, we encourage you guys to please reach out. This is the heartbeat of why we do what we do. Suicide is currently the 10th leading cause of death in the United States, and as of this recording, there are 132 suicides that take place each and every day on American soil. And when you scale back internationally, there are 800,000 successful suicides. That is 1 death roughly every 40 seconds. So if you or someone you know is struggling, you guys can go to victimsandvillains.net/hope. That resource is going to be right in the description wherever you guys are currently listening or streaming this. There you'll find resources that include the National Suicide Lifeline, which is 1-800-273-8255. You can also text HELP to 741-741. We also have a plethora of other resources, including churches, getting connected with counselors, LGBT resources like the Trevor Project, and also veteran hotline as well. Please, if you hear nothing else in the show, understand that you listening to this right now have value and worth. We get it. Suicide, depression, mental health, these are hard topics, and the stigma around them doesn't make it any easier. But please consider the resources right in the descriptions below wherever you guys are listening, because once again, you have value and you have worth. So please stay with us.
Oh, I mean, no. I mean, I'm not knocking the whole franchise. Like, I will watch. I'm a huge Scream fan. I will watch them at least once a year, at least. Same thing with Nightmare on Elm Street. Those will, especially in October, those movies are part of my natural rotation. Like, I have to watch one in October every year. But even though I love a franchise, that doesn't mean that it's not going to have a couple of bad movies. You know,
That's
like
fair.
yeah, like Freddy-vs-Jason. When I saw it in the theater, I loved it. I think I saw it twice because I just stepped back and enjoyed the fun of the fact that we had waited forever for this. Like, it could have been the worst movie in the world, and I still would have enjoyed it just for the sake that it made it to film. Looking at it now, going back, yeah, no, it was not a good movie, but still, there's that connection.
Yeah, on that note, like they had these ideas and these concepts of taking these like essentially juggernauts. Like Ronnie Yu did an interview for this movie, and he's talking about the idea and the concept that what he really wanted to do, what he was trying to do was essentially kind of recreate things that Hammer was doing or Universal was doing back in the 30s and 40s, to be like Frankenstein versus the Wolfman, or like Abbott and Costello meets the Mummy, something along those lines, to where you're having these two pinnacles of culture and like genre heroes and juggernauts that like never came to fruition. And it's ironic that like right around that time, like that it's, I don't want to say was a trend. It definitely was an attempted trend in horror, because I think like a year before this film had come out, Dimension was actually talking about doing a Michael Myers and Pinhead crossover that went through several different drafts, and it actually became reactionary to where before this movie became one of I think, if memory serves me correct, this is the biggest entry, like financially speaking, for both franchises.
Correct. Yeah,
So
it made somewhere around 115 to 120 million, I think, overall, which was the largest for both of these
yeah,
franchises.
these movies like take like next to nothing to produce, like in terms of like money. So like trying to repeat that success, like whereas there you had other studios that were essentially saying like, hey, we have these ideas and we have these characters. This is a dumb idea. Let's not do it. This movie came out, changed the game on all that stuff, and they were more and more people were getting serious about wanting to cross over other franchises with whatever they had in house, to where like there was a couple different ones that were like talked about, like I think Chucky versus Leprechaun was talked about.
That
uh
could have been awesome. I do
Pinhead
know that they did
Pinhead
do a
versus Hellraiser,
they did
or
Puppet Master
Halloween.
versus Demonic Toys.
Yeah.
Yep.
But that didn't get made till like years later. I think
Was it later?
I think it's like that's more of a recent thing. I think within like the last 10 years, that's when that came out. Could be wrong. Um
I believe, yeah, no, I believe
but I
you're
think
right.
it's a
I think it
more
did come out
recent one.
later. Maybe we can look at David Goya's
That
list
was
to see if he
actually
did it.
2004. It was right there in that same time period.
Oh, it was
Was it
04.
really?
Okay,
Interesting.
Yep.
there you go. I guess this was the time to do all of those. Everybody was like, all these franchises are dead. Crossover.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. It seemed like they're starting to die off and lose money and lose interest. Let's try something new with the same characters instead of
Mhm.
why don't we come up with new characters?
No, we don't need new characters.
And
Just right here.
then Michael Bay did Chainsaw Massacre remake, and everybody went, let's remake them all.
That's where it started.
That is, but I mean, Bay did this like in the same year. I think I think it came out a couple weeks, if not a couple months after Freddy versus Jason. And so like there are multiple attempts to bring this to the screen. As we've established in this podcast, how do you guys feel like this one fares in terms of like the adaptations or like the different versions we could have seen?
I think they kind of missed a lot of things from both series they could have brought in to tie it all together. I did think it was kind of interesting the way it was Freddy. I'm going to use Jason to make people remember who I am. And then he realizes he can't control him. I thought that was kind of cool, but I think they left out a lot of the history of both franchises a little bit too much. It was just enough of a nod in each direction that you knew what they were, but outside of that, and then
Well,
you had
go ahead.
the dime store Jay, the
Yes.
wannabe Jay.
Mhm.
I think
Every
it's
time I go so long between watching this one, it's like, was it Jay from Jay and Silent Bob in that movie? It's like, oh no, it's
no.
No.
your great value Jay.
Well, they had to do a high school version of him because he
Yeah.
would have been too old to bring in.
Yeah. And
I think it's
I think they keep the budgets down by using a lot of no-name actors.
yeah.
Oh, for sure. For sure.
But in this one, well, I'll bring that up in a second. To your point, Mark, I think the reason that I feel like in terms of like mythology, this one swings more in the hand of Freddy because Freddy has been a New Line property all along to the point where one of the phrases or one of the known attributes of New Line is it's the house that Freddy built. You
Mhm.
know, New Line wouldn't be what it is today without Freddy-Krueger.
Yeah.
And whereas, they technically the rights with Friday the 13th and Jason Voorhees always been messy. And I think some of that hurts what kind of mythology you're allowed to explore here. So it definitely feels like it's more mythol mythology wise, it feels like it's more in that the house of Fred Krueger.
Well, the
Yeah.
way go
Okay.
ahead.
No, I
Uh,
was gonna say no. I agree with that. So, but go ahead.
I was just going to say the way they played it out, it was supposed to be a winner of some sorts, but the way it plays out, it's almost a draw.
Yes.
So no one really won the battle.
No,
No,
because they were hoping to get a sequel out of it. That's why.
Yeah.
of
As
course.
with everything, you're gonna do something like this. You're not gonna want to just make one movie. But
See,
what I was gonna say, Josh, is that I
yeah.
I I agree with you about the mythology. Like I thought it leaned Freddy because of the premise of the film.
Mhm.
It really was all about Freddy needed to find a way to come back. So he found a way to do that through Jason. And then it backfires on him and he's got to take care of it. What surprised me out of all of it with New Line is they chose to make, despite the fact that a bunch of useless teenagers are getting killed in this movie, New Line kind of made Jason the sympathetic character and made Freddy the villain. Because of the two of them, like when you're watching this, you kind of like, I don't know how you get. The only thing I ever feel towards any of them is really like, I feel like, you feel for Jason because he's getting played. Even though they're running around murdering everybody, you're still feeling for the fact that like Freddy's the bad guy here and needs to die. Or that's
Yeah.
how I felt about it.
Yeah.
I think, yeah, I agree. But I think you need to have one of them be the sympathetic character because you need to have one of them be the hero, one of them be the villain. I mean, that's like traditional storytelling. It's a little bit harder to market. I mean, obviously, you're going to market these two juggernauts. Fans have been waiting years to see them, but like in terms of storytelling, like uh, when you boil down Friday the 13th, and like I don't want to piss anyone off, but Jason kind of boils down to just being a victim of something, a victim of trauma that also just happens to be, really close to mom. And that's kind of what he boils down to.
Are you saying
And
Jason's a mama's boy?
for lack of
Yeah.
a better term, I mean, but then
I mean, you can't become look. There's no mama's boy bigger than that. The dude came back from the dead to avenge his mom. You can't.
facts,
That's it. Can't top
facts.
that.
Also, like but you look at the history of Fred Krueger, and I mean he's despicable to the point to where like Wes Craven's gone on record saying like Krueger is like one of the worst, most despicable humans you can get. He's a child killer. They've alluded to him being a child predator, a child molester, like
No,
literally
that's only the remake. Let's not mix that
all
in.
all of all of the above. But they tried to originally. Craven's gone on record saying that they've tried to make it, but it was a little bit too
It was too dicey.
it was too dicey
Yeah.
for that era of filmmaking, which is fine. But I mean, Freddy from a franchise standpoint is the more despicable of the two. Jason just kind of seems like he's a guy that has, as a response to this trauma, is just kind of stunted in growth. Whereas Freddy actually like knows the difference and kind of embraces a lot of that stuff.
Well, they kind of hint at the fact that Jason might also be handicapped, so to speak, mentally challenged, however you want to say it.
I think some of that comes from like him being like emotionally stunted. Like statistically speaking, like, and I'm not a doctor. Before I say this, I'm not a doctor. I'm not a psychologist. This is just stuff from what I've read. If a child in development experiences trauma great enough, which in this case was literally drowning, death,
Yeah.
you know, what you and then turns around and also experiences the death of a parent in, you know, let's say the better part of 10 years, just to kind of, you know, kind of narrow it down, that essentially your lot like brain in your brain you are resorting back to that simpler time, back to that happier time. So you are essentially, while your body is physically growth and like continues to grow, it continues to, like in his case, you know, make him a behemoth. He has either the emotional capacity or development of that 8-year-old child that drowned in Crystal Lake.
Yeah, I can definitely see that. Not to mention the fact of he also had a physical deformity, which was clear and present from the beginning as well. So they did hint that there was something up with Jason. He wasn't just a you know, a quote unquote regular normal boy, so to speak. So, but even still, like when you get to this film and you see how they're playing the two characters, I get that you're trying to create, like you said, one of them has to be a sympathetic character and one isn't. I don't necessarily agree with that, because your sympathetic characters in this sense in a movie like this should be your main characters that are getting tormented by the two of them.
Sure.
You're supposed to be, you know, like Laurie and Will and the rest of the cast. Like those are the ones that you're supposed to have sympathy for because of what's going on. They're, you know, just to get into the film a little bit, like they're just kind of there to as either cannon fodder or to make sure the two of them really face off against one another.
But that is Friday the 13th. That's how Friday the 13th tells storytelling. Like when you look at the victims between Nightmare and Friday, Nightmare victims are always developed. They might not be three-dimensionally developed like we have with Heather Langenkamp's character, or even the character from you know, 4 into 5, but Alice, that's I was forgetting that name. But for the majority of Friday the 13th characters, they are one note, they are thrown away, and they applied that formula from the 80s into here. So I think it's just an aspect that fans come to expect when you watch a Friday the 13th film.
That's kind of the purpose of all the teenagers in these movies in general, though, is just to get slaughtered.
No, and I'm definitely not arguing that. This was probably one where I felt like, even though they tried to give Laurie and Will like an interesting backstory to make you kind of feel something towards them, because you had these two bigger, supernatural behemoths going at it. Like, I think that kind of got lost along the way. I'm not, cannon fodder, yeah, totally for it. I'm like, but there wasn't a main character I grasped onto. Like Laurie and Will, I didn't grasp onto the way I would have grasped onto Nancy or Laurie or, any of the final girls in, Friday the 13th.
Sydney,
you name it. Right.
Alice,
That was
Ginny.
right. And that was the issue I had with this. And I think that brings me into something different, because I think it's the way, I think that had to do with the script and the direction, which actually affected that, not necessarily the actors.
Well, so when Ronnie Yu goes to talk about this movie, he talks about Jason and Freddy both as monsters. And when you look at the recent wave that we've gotten of these Godzilla, King Kong, the MonsterVerse, that as Legendary calls it, you are kind of presented with this problem to where there's not enough like emotional depth to tell stories of these two behemoths. And so you're likewise also presented that same problem here. Like, I don't know how you would have done something completely like different. I would have been okay to kind of have maybe like, you know, uh, I guess like more party sequences, like the sequence with them in the cornfields and like the rave. Like, I think that's a great example of like having these like really empty set pieces that exist solely to elevate and push the narratives of Freddy and Jason forward. Because everyone else just kind of feels like a bystander. And you're not really, like you said, like you're not really given reason to connect to them. And like, can't remember the kid's name, but like the character that like was in the Weston Hills with Will, whose
Oh
brother
yeah,
whose
I don't
whose
even remember his
brother
name.
was the
He was the
guy
one
the bully
uh,
from A Christmas Story.
from A Christmas Story.
I
Yeah,
was wondering if you caught, yeah.
yeah. I
like,
love that connection.
it's
Um
like, I can't ever see him as anybody but Flick.
No, I don't think anybody can.
No.
That's who he is and always will be.
But it's like, I don't know, like they try to establish some sense of like depth between like out of him being a victim of someone that has experienced Freddy, and then you also kind of have that with Will and Laurie, and
Mhm.
kind of like the whole like dad thing. But like this movie just it's fun, but it's like when you look at it from like a depth perspective, like there's not a whole lot that this movie provides.
No. And I think that's a missed opportunity from what it could have been. And that's where I feel like I think it's the script and the direction that suffered. And we had talked about it maybe either before we were recording or early on in the podcast, and Mark, you had brought it up how
Yeah.
like the script itself, which I'm currently reading online. I got like partially through it before we started recording. The script online, it's like it was a 120-page script, so it was roughly a 2-hour movie. And then from my understanding, when they shot it, it was like it came out even longer than that. But just reading the first third or quarter of the script, Mark's character has more depth to it just in the scenes I read in there that they just skip over in this movie. And that's where the cut, like I feel like the cuts came in this film where the characters were going to get some depth so that they can just focus more on Freddy and Jason, because a lot of the story you hear in the movie is told to you by all of the characters. They don't show it to you. There's just a bunch of really clunky dialogue explaining things to you so we can run along at a fast pace to get to Freddy and Jason doing their thing.
How would you guys like to help us get mental health resources into schools, conventions, and other events? Well, now you can. Simply go to patreon.com/victims and villains for as little as $1 a month. You guys can help us get mental health resources into current and upcoming generations, educate and break down stigma surrounding mental health, suicide, and depression. And you get exclusive content that you can't get anywhere else. And you guys can tell us which Nicolas Cage movie you want us to cover, and we'll do it. All it takes to get started is to go to patreon.com/victims and villains, or simply click the link in the episode description wherever you guys are currently listening or streaming this episode. Pick your tier and get started today. Yes, it's that simple. So quickly select the tier that you want and help us get hope into the hands of the depressed and the suicidal today.
Also, let me ask you guys this, because like historically speaking, with both of these franchises, both of these characters are coming into like really historical low points for each franchise. Like Jason X, which we talked about earlier this year, it's now a cult classic, but like it kind of
And
stands alone from the
it's
rest of
still
everything.
it still
It's
has one of my favorite kills in all of the Jason movies.
same. But like what I'll say is like it's one of the lowest points for a lot of fans of the franchise as a whole. And then on the Freddy side, you have ignoring the masterpiece of New Nightmare because it stands on its own. But continuity wise, the last one being um Freddy's Dead, the Final Nightmare, you're kind of you feel like you're like essentially climbing up a waterfall, because you're having to kind of regain the interest in these characters for one, but also to like balance a lot of this stuff. And so like I think I love slashers to death, but slashers are notoriously like a type of genre that I run to if I'm not wanting to think, if I'm not wanting a lot of depth. I want to see a high body count. I think this movie could have benefited from a lower body count and like more intelligible characters. Which it sounds like that was the approach of it. And then one of the things that uh the special features on the Shout Factory Blu-ray talks about is David Goyer actually got brought in to polish that script and tighten it up. But here's the thing is like we live in an era now, we're saying this now, where scripts are, allowed to be 2 hours. I think the last three Halloween movies we've gotten were each pushing 2 hours. The latest Exorcist is 2 hours. Like to have, not to
Mm-hmm.
mention that the newest development of the next iteration of Jason is going to be a mini series on Peacock. Like we are
The
more accustomed to these long format things, but when you look at the slasher genre of the era when this came out, it was a lot. Everything had to be condensed to 90 minutes. I felt like if you went over 90 minutes, you kind of just lost your audience.
Yeah, and there were a lot of movies that were a victim of that too. Like we had talked about during the Event Horizon episode,
Yep.
it got chopped down by like something like 40 minutes or something like that.
Yep.
And it lost a lot of story and depth that it had originally because we want to throw out a horror movie. They're not very story intent. It's all just people dying. Let's get it out there as quick as we
Mm-hmm.
can.
Yeah, and also like to bring another example of a film we covered earlier this year, Possession from 1981. Umbrella released a Blu-ray of it earlier this year, and on it, it actually has the original US cut, and it's cut by almost like an hour. Like
Wow.
scenes are like, misplaced and like put out of order. It's like a semi cohesive movie, but like
Mm-hmm.
it's definitely more of like in lines of like WTF. And if you've seen Possession, you know it's already WTF if you've seen the full length version. So like I don't know. For me, I think that this movie definitely could have like benefited from like a director's cut, and it definitely could have benefited from like allowing these characters to be a little bit more relatable or intelligent. But I think people are like, body count. Give us all the bodies.
Well, yeah, I think both franchises had gotten to the point of that was all of the intrigue that they felt was left in them. Was how do we kill people and how do you kill them in cool ways? So people like it. Story be damned. Otherwise, New Nightmare in '93 would have made a ton of money, and not have ended the Freddy franchise at that point.
It's also ironic too, because going back to films, pushing that 2 hour limit, that is the longest one that is in the Nightmare canon.
and one of the best ones by far.
Exactly. And I think it's because also like because it dared to kind of step outside of the normal trend, whereas this one was
Mhm.
like, we're just gonna stay in, what we know these fans like. And
Mhm.
I'm curious, like there's a point in this movie where like the character design of Freddy feels very reminiscent of New Nightmare. Did either of you guys pick up on that?
Yep, noticed it right away.
Yeah, he looked more modern, I guess.
Yeah, a little more demonic. Like he had
Yeah,
that
That's the
demonic
word.
look to it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, he was the sleep demon or something like that.
Yep,
Mhm.
exactly. And it's one thing I'll always go back to just with New Nightmare really quickly is I always wondered if New Nightmare had come out post Scream, when Scream made meta cool, if that movie would not have been a big hit, because it was Wes Craven hit meta before meta hit, a general audience the way it needed to.
It's partially why the reason that, I love that movie. It's what I argue it's the best Freddy Krueger movie that we've ever gotten. It's up for debate. To me,
Well,
it's
I
the
go
best
for
one.
first
So
in New Nightmare 1 and 2.
yeah,
Those top first and second for me.
yeah. Do you
Yeah,
guys? Go
I
ahead,
don't
Mark.
think I've seen New Nightmare, but in the journey through the entire movie collection, we do have the Nightmare on Elm Street collection that has it. So
It's definitely worth seeing, because one, you don't have to watch any of the other ones except for Nightmare 1
What
to
he
get
said.
it.
Yeah.
And it's a standalone movie outside of that. So highly recommend.
Yes. I also recommend potentially just like watching like portions of Never Sleep Again, which was the Nightmare on Elm
Yes.
Street documentary before
Mhm.
that, because like some of the cultural context that's in New Nightmare, it makes more sense if you've seen that documentary.
True.
But Mark, maybe we just need to do a New Nightmare episode.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, because we're kind of dancing around Freddy versus Jason and going at like all these other movies. I think that really says a lot for how we felt about this one.
it's not the best entry in either series, but it's an entertaining one at the core is what it boils down to. It's not deep. There's no characters you really care about other than Freddy and Jason.
No.
But
And it's a movie to watch apparently if you're like high on ecstasy or something, because some of those sequences, man, I forgot what Ronnie you did with this movie, but like the weird slow-mo and then the frenetic scenes with like frames cut out of it to make it all trippy and stuff. I was like, oh geez. I go, what were you thinking? I could, that was just wild.
I also like I took as I was taking notes on this, like there are like the CGI for one did not age well in this movie.
No.
And there's actually a line that I want to call out that did not age well, and that's like when Laurie first finds out about Freddy Krueger, she like there's a character that says something to the extent of his name is Freddy Krueger and he likes little girls. And I was just like this
Oh, in her dream.
yeah, that did not age well one bit.
Oh no, I can shout out so many lines in this that did not age well. First off, the entire scene where they're sitting around the table and they figure out the plot of the movie in 5 seconds, or Laurie just literally just spurting out, Freddy died by fire, Jason by water. How can we use that? I'm like, are you kidding me? I was like, there's so many lines in this movie I cringe at.
Yeah, it like knowing the history of this movie and how many different like takes that they had on this, and them arriving at this one and being like, "This is the best we got." I'm just kind of like befuddled because I'm just like,
This was the best. You know what the sad thing
"What?"
is, reading through the development phase of this, I want to go back to 1996 New Line and go beg them, because they offered Guillermo del Toro and Peter Jackson a shot at this and they said no. And I'm like, those are the guys you back up the money truck to. Of course, they weren't as huge names as they are now, but still, can you imagine a Peter Jackson Freddy versus Jason or a Del Toro Freddy versus Jason? I mean,
Del Toro still suffers from that now. Every time he tries to do a movie, the studio step in and refuse to give him a budget to do it.
yeah, I don't know why. I mean, he's so good.
Yeah,
But he has Netflix. He's got like a deal with Netflix now, so that
Yes.
might be coming to an end.
Mm,
Fingers crossed.
let's hope so. But even like Peter Jackson at that point wasn't exactly, I mean, he had done Dead Alive and, Meet the Feebles and stuff by that point. He wasn't a big name like he is now. But even still, seeing what he did prior, like it would have been nice to see them like try and persuade him in. That would have been nice.
Yeah, because he also like this would have been his second attempt because he actually before they had proposed the script for Freddy's Dead, The New Nightmare, they actually had approached him and he was like actually actively developing Nightmare on Elm Street 6 before they went the route of Freddy's Dead.
who, Del Toro?
No, Peter Jackson. It
Oh,
was
Peter
it was
Jackson.
right after
'Cause
he had done Meet the Feebles, and I think it was right before
Dead
Dead
Alive.
Alive.
Because with Del Toro, he did Mimic, and he said he
Yep.
had such a horrible experience dealing with Hollywood, he almost left Hollywood completely and just went back to making movies in other countries.
He
Wow.
had a terrible experience with the Weinsteins.
That's not
Well,
surprising.
but he openly stated that he almost didn't
Yeah.
keep doing work for Hollywood because of how bad of an experience it was doing Mimic.
Well, that's because the Weinsteins were always very hands-on and not just
Yeah.
with the films.
Also, I think like having him being in like the position to do a Freddy versus Jason would have been a really interesting take, especially at that time because he had only up to that point had only done Kronos, which Kronos is like his first film. If you guys haven't seen it, believe it's streaming on Max. It's a Spanish film. It's incredible. It's one hell of a debut.
Hadn't
But
Devil's Backbone been out too?
Devil's Backbone was 2001. So, yeah, so his filmography is really interesting because like he had that, then he had Mimic, then he went back to do Devil's Backbone, then he came back to do Blade 2 and he kind of been back and forth with like making like English and Spanish films.
And he has a strange fascination with orphans and orphanages.
Yes.
It's creepy.
Yes.
And I've never been able to find out why.
It's creepy.
There's got to be a story behind it. Just a little side note with just another note with the development. When this script was finally ready to be made, where they were going to move on it, they went back to Del Toro, and they also went to Wes Craven and Ronnie Yu, who all turned it down at first. Ronnie Yu turned it down the first time around, and then they went to Rob Zombie, and he turned it down because he was doing House of a Thousand Corpses.
That's interesting.
Yeah, because they did circle around a lot of the right people, and unfortunately, it was Ronnie Yu that wound up getting it. I don't think he did it any favors.
It could have been worse. They could have ended up with you, Bowl.
Oh yes, well yes, yeah, right.
It's
that's when you know you've asked everybody in Hollywood and they've all said no.
He's a director that gets me. He complains that it's source material, that's why his movies suck. But he's like the writer, director, and producer.
Yeah, it's the source material. Yeah, but you wrote the script. Yeah, but it's the source material.
Yeah. So then why did you choose that?
Yeah, you're the source, dude.
I think it's I think it's interesting to hear that because most people may or may not know this. House of Thousand Corpses was shot and done in 2000, actually set like on the shelf for like up to I think 3 years before it actually came out. And
did you hear Zombie's interview about how that movie got pitched and bought and everything?
I did. Yes. That movie was originally
just kind of threw it out of his ass at a producer.
hmm It's supposed to be done by Universal. Universal thought it wasn't marketable, it wasn't salvageable. So then they sat on it for a while. It went to another studio. That process repeated, and then it ended up at Lionsgate, where they've since made the trilogy of the Firefly family since. But man, I just like the history of this movie is like absolutely more entertaining,
in the
if
movie.
not as entertaining as the movie, because like
Mm-hmm.
I'm fascinated by projects that never see the light of day, and I'm even more fascinated by those projects that do see the light of day, but like Freddy versus Jason have so much crap that happens in them.
Yeah.
Um that it's just absolutely crazy to me.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I try and go back and like you guys said, like because we've all said it was fun at least, like trying to find any high points in a film like this. You know, like for me, it would the showdown at the end was just flat out enjoyable because
Yeah.
you waited a good hour 10 before you got to see the moment everybody was in the theater for. And that was probably the one sequence where I'm like, that's where I felt like it was worth having someone like Ronnie Yu in it, because that's his bread and butter, is like that action kind of stuff. And to me, like, I thought that was great. It's almost like I wanted a split director on this film. Like, if you would have had Ronnie Yu to handle the action sequences for the third act and then had somebody else doing the horror portion of the first two, I think it could have been a lot stronger.
It's
Well, the way they did the final battle, they gave each of them their own home turf so they
Yep.
could show
Yep.
off on the other one a little bit.
Exactly.
which is a real genius thing, because like at the end of this, like as we've established, like it's a draw. Like
Mhm.
it's like Jason won, but then you have that Freddy wink, and you're like, well, technically Freddy's like undead, so he
So
can't
was
die.
Jason.
Yeah, so it's kind of like at the end of it, it's kind of like two zombies essentially fighting one another. Like it's gonna be a draw regardless. So
Yeah.
I think really having both fandoms kind of be acknowledged and have that was just a really smart idea for them.
Yeah. Well, and again, the idea behind him being alive in the end, which wasn't the initial ending per se of the film, right? It's what they wound up with. But the idea of opening it up to a sequel, which at the time they were courting the idea of bringing Ash in. That was supposed to be
Yeah, that was like the third one or something, the second or third one to that series.
yep, was Freddy, Jason, Ash.
Yeah, so actually one of the things that I actually found, if you guys Google on YouTube Freddy versus Jason versus Ash, they did take that script, make it into a comic, and you can actually
Comic book.
watch the
Yeah.
entirety of the comic. It's like 75 minutes. It's
Yep.
not super long. And I discovered it yesterday, and it is
Oh,
now on
nice.
my list.
Oh, you
So
didn't know about the comic?
I
Yeah,
did
I
know
knew about
about
the
the
comic.
comic,
Okay.
and it bothers me to no end that it is not like able to read anywhere digitally. It is one of
Oh,
my
bummer.
it is one of my holy grail comic book series, but those series are like each of those issues are like stupid expensive.
Yeah, because
I
they didn't
haven't
make
even
that
looked them
many.
up. I haven't even looked them up. I remember seeing them when they came out when I used to collect comic books regularly.
Yeah.
Oh
They
yeah. It's a set of 6 apparently, right?
Yep.
Yeah, you can get them on eBay. Let's see. I see 150 for the set
Yeah, it's more than I'm
is the
willing to
lowest.
spend.
Mhm.
So,
Up 115.
yeah.
So yeah, no, that's pricey.
For 6 books, yes. Um
Yes.
Winding down on this though, I just kind of for context, we brought this up earlier, but a portion of the final technically canon film for Nightmare on Elm Street, the Freddy's Dead, is that like everyone has forgotten Freddy. And you see a little bit of that here in the opening, and I think that the way that they handle Freddy Krueger, after the first murder, and the way that the town of Springwood handles is very akin to how we handle mental health as a culture. I think it's very kind of like very hush hush. You don't talk about it. And if you do talk about it, you're, silenced or shamed very similarly to how Lori is in the process of just getting answers in this movie.
Yeah, no, it really is. And it's just, to me, it's just one of those things that society, to your point, like society in general has been trying to break that down, and I think in the last 20 years maybe they've done it to a degree, but there's still that overwhelming gut reaction people have of like, you can't bring these things up or you will be shamed. You can't bring up
Yeah.
trauma because it's not socially acceptable. And the sooner we get over that thought process, the better I think we'll all be, because who doesn't go through trauma?
Well, right now it's kind of almost like two sides of the same coin. You don't want to bring it up because you get labeled or people might think differently of you or something, but then something happens and it's, oh, it was because of this. It's like, well, you didn't want them to talk about it in the first place.
Yeah.
So which is it? Is it good or not? I mean,
I
to talk about it.
I think it's this idea too, like to bring it up as like society. The reason that there is this stigma is because we have this some of the older generation that's still with us had this practice of, especially for men, you don't talk about your mental health, you don't talk about your feelings, you don't talk about your emotions. If you show
No.
any sign of that, you're weak, you're a girl, you're a sissy man, X, Y, and Z. And so I think that kind of practice and that kind of approach to mental health has been something that like has been passed down from generation to generation, to where like we're slowly starting to see, I not maybe not my in my generation, but maybe the generation that's after mine, we're slowly starting to see kind of like this like ripple effect of like, I don't want to be here anymore. Like, life sucks, and I want to talk about why life sucks.
Yeah, and I think that's the progression that we need to have. We need it to become one of those things where it's just something that we do as the human race.
Yeah.
We should be able to be open about things like that, because the more open we are about that, not only is it become more socially acceptable, but it also opens the ability for people to process and to recover from it without having that fear of like, how am I going to be viewed if I admit something like this?
It's almost like we approach it this like where we're not supposed to like feel anything. Like it's like one of the things that like, being raised in the church and still being a Christian, like one of the things that like I often find is like you don't talk about certain things because like you're gonna be shamed. And it's like, well, there's this practice of like preaching like you shouldn't feel anger, you shouldn't feel lust, or you shouldn't feel like X, Y, or Z. It's like we almost do that as a society, as like a larger whole, that like we get this like being almost like condemned for like feeling the very things that like we're emotional about. Like as human beings, like there is an emotional core to us, there is an emotional being to us. And you know not talking about it is not going to make it true. Like it doesn't take away the fact that like it is very real.
Oh, it's not so much not talking about it. It's the not talking about it in a manner that's not considered normal.
Sure.
That's where the issue is.
Yeah.
If it's outside what people think you're supposed to feel, then you've got an issue. That's where it becomes a problem.
Yeah. Or quote unquote, unacceptable.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I don't know. I like to me. I think we just need to kind of be in, you know, open practice that it's like, all right, we need to be willing to be vulnerable and be willing to talk about it, because we all feel things. Like we all feel, the pressures of the economy, or we feel things about like, trauma or grief or divorce or heartbreak or happiness, sadness, joy, X, Y, and Z. Like that list just goes on and on. But like, you know, I just I don't know like how to describe it. Like I feel like we're doing better as a society, but it's also very much like what we see here is like if you ask too much questions or you're too open about what you're feeling, then there's this level of like you suck as a human being, and like you're just belittled for it essentially.
Well, there's almost no middle ground. You either have one group that don't mention or talk about the issues that they do have, or you have the other side of the coin that uses an excuse for absolutely everything.
Yeah.
Because I know people with diagnosed issues that use it as an excuse to just be complete and total assholes or do whatever they want. And when it's
Sure.
brought up, oh, I have this diagnosis, you can't get mad at me for it.
Mm-hmm.
So there's two sides to the coin.
Yeah. Eh,
Yeah.
yeah. Situations like that like really like get under my skin because it just kind of feels like you're taking advantage of it.
Oh, they
And
are. Absolutely are.
I feel like in order to like be like in a place of like healthy mental health, you need to like not be like stuck and like in taking advantage of situations like that, but learn that like there's something wrong with me. I need to get help, or I need to seek help, because if there's something physically wrong with you, you go to a doctor. If there's something mentally wrong with you, you go to a therapist, a counselor, a psychologist. Like, you have to seek out, or you can check out one of the many resources we have in our mental health resource library, which link is in the show notes.
Well said.
Yeah. So I think that's gonna do it for us on this episode of Victims and Villains. If you guys are, well, abyss gazing, yeah. So if you
Well,
guys have seen uh Freddy versus Jason, let us know where you guys stand. So yeah. Where can people find the retro gamers online?
you guys can find us on Facebook.com/Retro Gamers Podcast, on Instagram at Retro Gamers Podcast, on X, which I hate saying, at Retro Gamers Pod. You can listen to us wherever you listen to podcasts. You can watch us on YouTube at Retro Gamers Podcast, or you can email us at email@theretrogamers.com.
So would it be Retro Gamers Podcast?
It would be
Just
Retro
on
Gamers.
anything.
Yeah, basically Retro Gamers Podcast for anything except X. X is Retro Gamers Pod.
Ah,
Yeah.
Just to trip you up.
Mark, where can people find you?
hiding in the middle of the South.
Well,
Actually-
we've got it narrowed down. You mentioned your state earlier, so we got that part.
Yeah. I don't do very much right now, but I do have the Instagram stuff for painting, which I'm still slacking on updating.
At this
As
point, it's
Josh
just a
shakes his
running
head.
joke. It's just a
It
running
is.
joke.
It is. Yeah, titanium juggernaut painting.
It's one of the foundations of abyss gazing here.
Nice.
You guys can
Just the
find me.
fact that I'm the old fart and never update my Instagram.
You guys can find me on Letterboxd. I am at Captain Nostalgia. You guys can find Abyss Gazing wherever you guys get your podcasts from. Check out my other podcast, That's High Praise, a Nicolas Cage podcast. Also, wherever you guys get your podcasts from. You guys can follow our previously mentioned parent company, Victims and Villains. We're on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, YouTube, and Patreon, wherever you guys get your podcast from, because I refuse to call Twitter X. It will always be Twitter.
As I said on my podcast that's dropping this week, when I say X, it immediately makes me think of in my early 20s when people were popping ecstasy and getting X'd everywhere. And I'm like, that just doesn't sound right to me.
Well, here is a social media tidbit that not everyone may be aware of. X is actually being sued by another company named X for the name.
Excellent.
So
Excellent. The sooner it goes back to Twitter, the better, quote unquote. Again, I don't know how much better that is, but
Well, remember, the longer you gaze into the abyss, the more the abyss gazes back into you. Happy the Friday the 13th. See you Wednesday.